In this video, we're going to look at a common issue in medical animation that's probably useful for all sorts of animation. It's when you've got an object and you want to show another object somewhat inside of it. So showing an organ inside the body, for example, like the brain here. I should say this brain is not part of this body, so it doesn't really fit that well. But you get the idea. So you might have an animation where you start with an establishing shot of a person and you want to then transition to the idea that you're talking about a certain part of the brain and reveal the brain and show that it's still inside the body. So something like this. And what I'm going to suggest is doing this in post. So here in After Effects, or if you're using Nuke or something like that, you can probably do something similar rather than trying to make this sort of look directly in 3D. Now, I'll just say from the beginning that there's nothing wrong with trying to do everything in 3D. And you can get some really interesting looks that would be difficult to do in 2D. But the problem with doing too much only in 3D is that it's difficult to edit. It's difficult to make changes if your client or content advisor wants something, or if you notice a mistake, or if you want to change the timing of something. You have to think of animation as an iterative process where there's a lot of trial and error. And if the trial and error is around rendering, then you're going to be spending a lot of time rendering. So if you can render things out in a way that allows you to edit them in post and to experiment, then it's very quick. So for example, let's say in something like this, the brain starts being revealed right around here. If your client says, actually, I'd like to start to see the brain fully revealed by the time we get here, we don't have to re-render. We can just change some of the animated settings that we already have here. So going something like this. It's not a great example. We can just go in and change our levels on this layer, and you can see the brain becomes much more visible earlier on. Your content advisor is happy, you're happy, and you didn't have to spend a long time re-rendering. So we'll go through building this up, and if we just go over to Maya, you can see that it's a very simple scene. All I have is this head model and then this brain model inside this. So if I just go into, I'll just reveal this, the brain model like this. And this brain is made up of many smaller parts, and the head is made up of the head and two eyes. And really, I just want to render these two things out separately and put them together in After Effects. So what we'll look at is using the render setup here, and also using in the render settings AOVs, so the arbitrary output values as part of the Arnold renderer. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on showing you what makes it difficult in 3D, but you may think that it would be just easy to go in and instead of doing that transmission or that opacity change in After Effects, you could just go to the material of the head model and change the transparency here. And you can do that. So if I just turn up the transparency, you can start to see the brain through here. And if I open up the Arnold render view to do a render, then you can see that, yes, you can see the brain through here, but it's a little bit distorted looking. And that's because Arnold is a physical renderer, so it's treating it as if it's being refracted through this transmissive surface. So you could solve that here in Maya by taking this head material, turning down its index of refraction to a lower value, like 1.1, so you won't see as much distortion. It's still distorted, so maybe you just go to 1, so there's no distortion at all. But, it doesn't really look like a physically transmissive material. And one of the things now is that you're seeing all these other things on the inside. If I turn it up higher and maybe move to the side here. So we can start to see that on the other side of the head, you can actually see the other ear now. We can see the ear on this side. We can see the eyes and the mouth bag because this is all transmissive. And there are things you could do to solve that. You can select the head model itself, and under render stats, you can turn off double-sided, and that will get rid of the back of the model. But you can still see the front side of the back ear. You can still see the front side of the mouth bag, the front side of the eyes, and so on. Well, the eyes are a different model, so I'd have to turn it off for those too. So again, you could solve this problem here with some work, but it gives you very little flexibility later on. So we're not going to do it that way. We're going to rely on rendering in layers and output arbitrary output values and put them back together in After Effects. So I'm not going to actually re-render because I have already done this, but we're going to open up render setup and do just a very simple arrangement of our objects into layers. So it's this icon up here. And so we're going to create a render layer for the head model and a render layer for the brain model. And let me just delete these and I'll recreate them. So to create a render layer, we'll just click on the plus sign here, and we'll call this head layer. Click on it again and make one called brain layer, of course with underscores or no spaces at any rate. And we want to put the head model or models on this layer, but we can't until we right click and say create a collection. We'll call this head geo, and middle mouse drag the head onto here. It's a group because I have, let me just do that again, because I have the two eyes and the actual head model itself. And the reason you put this into a collection rather than just on the layers, because you can have multiple collections on each layer for treating each element differently. So you may have a collection for something that you want to render like the head, but then you may have something that you want to cast a shadow onto the head, but you don't want to see the object. And you can put on another collection and then turn on shadow casting, turn off its primary visibility. It adds a lot of flexibility. We'll do the same thing for the brain layer. We'll create a collection and we will middle mouse drag the brain group onto that. And that's all there is to it. Now, by default, it should just render with all the lights in your scene on each layer. You don't have to make a change here. If for some reason you wanted different lights on each layer, you could drag this lights box down, middle mouse drag it onto your layer, and then you could set which lights you want to see in this layer. It should be all lights by default, so you shouldn't need this. I have run into this. I'm on a PC right now, but on the Mac, I've had trouble with this, and the only way to get the lights working was to drag one of these on, but I don't need to do it here. So just check that if you have any trouble with your rendering. The other thing to look at here is that by default, this top level one will be turned on, and this is the master layer. So that's what renders if you don't have any other layers set up. But we don't need the master layer to render, so we'll just turn that off. We just want these two to render. Okay, easy. So now we'll open up the render settings. And of course, you set up your normal render. I'm using EXR at half precision with merge AOVs turned on because we're going to render out AOVs and we want them all to be in the same file. The size, the frame range, and so on. And one thing that's really useful up here is the file name naming strategy. Rather than just typing something in here, you can right click and say name your file, the rendered files with the name of the scene. I always do underscore, then right click, and then choose render layer. So we'll pick up this name head layer and brain layer and put that into the separate renders that you're going to get for each of these. Under AOVs, I'd suggest you add the Z depth and the crypto material and crypto object. And I think these come standard in Arnold now, the cryptos. If not, you'll just have to download them somewhere, but I think they should be there. I always output these with my renders. They don't add any real time to the render. And they're just super useful once you get into post. You can do so much with them, and we'll talk about that once we get there. And that's it. You can just set up your render now. And to render, of course, we go to rendering, and we have two options. We can go to batch render, and if you have an Arnold license, then it will render without watermarks. You can always check your Arnold license by going to Arnold Licensing License Manager, Single User Licensing, and it shows up here. That's great. If it doesn't show up there, or if you don't have access to an Arnold license for whatever reason, you can go to render, and instead of choosing batch render, choose render sequence. This will render in the foreground in a window, so it's a little bit slower, not much, but there will be no watermarks, so you can get by without an Arnold license. But just make sure you open the options for this and go to make sure the correct camera is selected and all render enabled layers is turned on. If you have more than one camera, you can turn that on too. Again, I'm not going to render because I've done it already. So we finish rendering, and what we'll wind up with, if we go over to After Effects and just go to Import, let's change our view here. So you'll wind up with a series of files. So one set named after the Maya file plus the render layer, and then going from 1 to 48, because that's what I rendered. And then the second render layer is the same file name plus the name of the render layer, 1 to 48. I've already imported these, so I won't do it again. And if we just double click on one of these, the head layer, we can see that we just get very simple render like this, and if we click on the brain, then we get something simple like this. And these will render faster than if you're trying to do transparency in Maya, because it doesn't have to calculate transparency. We're going to do all of that in 2D. So it's a good way to streamline your rendering process, just in terms of the time it takes as well. So let's set this up, and I'm going to show you two different ways to do this. One very simple, and one a little more complicated, but not much, but to get a slightly different look. So we'll grab the head layer and drag it onto the composition. One thing you should double check, if you right click on the, not the composition, but the imported file stack here, and go to Interpret Footage Main, just make sure it's using the right frame rate. So I rendered at 24 frames per second. And it should pick that up, but in case it doesn't, just make sure you change that for both of the imported files. So we've got this one here. I want a kind of lighter colored backdrop, so Control Y or Command Y to make a solid. And then if I want to change the color of that after the fact, Control Shift Y or Command Shift Y, you can open that up and change the color. I was just trying to match the color of my model so it blends in here. And then we can drag the brain renders on top. And so if nothing else, we already have something that's sort of working. And the easiest thing you can do is select the brain layer. And let me just rename these so it's easier to see. Brain and head. We could just take the brain layer, hit T for opacity, and reduce that. And it already looks kind of like it's inside the head. So pretty easy. We don't have any of those problems of refraction, seeing the back of the model, or anything like that. Another way you can do this is to duplicate the head model, Control or Command D, put it on top of the brain, and control its opacity. So T for opacity, and you get the same sort of effect here. Very simple, and we can set keys on the opacity of the overlying head model, going from 100 to some lower value, so we can see that on the inside. Very simple. Now let's look at one thing we can do to correct something here. So maybe we didn't want to see all of this brainstem, the spinal cord starting to emerge here. We actually rendered that out already, and so that's kind of a pain. Your content advisor says, oh, I don't want to see that. Your client says, can we get rid of that? So you could re-render. It doesn't take that long in a shot like this. But since we rendered out kryptomat, let's see what we can do with this brain. So I'm going to just hide everything else for now. I'm going to duplicate the brain model. The brain render. So Control D or Command D. And I'm going to add the kryptomat effect. Now you may have to download this. It's free, or maybe it's included in After Effects now. I'm not sure. Kryptomat. So what kryptomat does is it reads that information of, we asked it to do a kryptomat material, a kryptomat object. And for material, it just looks at everything in this render that had the same material in Arnold and gives it this flat color. If we click over here under kryptomat, and we'll get this option box and switch to crypto object, you can see that because that brain group actually contained many separate models, now it's giving this flat color to each of those models, and each of these colors is different. And all this allows you to do is make a selection mask that will persist in 3D. So if I just zoom in here, if I want to hide this part of the model, I'm just clicking on these different colored areas. It's going forward in my timeline so I can see the ones in the back. Maybe I want to get rid of this stuff too. I'm holding down Shift to do this. Hold down Control click to cut that out. Okay, so something like that. I think there's another little piece here. There, got it all. So we're seeing all the colors and the matte right now. So I can change the output here to matte only, and we just get something like this. And so what's the use of this? Well, in the brain layer underneath this, so we get the matte on top of the brain layer underneath, we can take the full colored brain underneath and pick whip the track matte up to the layer above it, change the track matte type from alpha to luma, and then invert that. And so it's essentially just masking out that area for every frame. So it looks a little weird here, right, because it's just cutting it out. So it's not a perfect solution, but we're going to make it work for us for a quick change for our client. You can see there's this outline here, and this is just a bit of a weakness of this practice, but we're going to solve it just by going to this layer, the one that has the matte on it, the kryptomat, and we're going to add a mini-max effect. And this just allows you to expand or contract the alpha and color channels. So we'll change this from color to alpha and color and just leave it at maximum and turn it to 1 pixel. So it just expands this by 1 pixel. So it looks a bit weird here, but when we turn around to the back, it's pretty good. It's cutting out 1 extra pixel here. We could get rid of that later on once we get maybe past this point. Let's keyframe that radius from 1, down to 0. We'll get. Can't do that actually, because then this comes back. So let's just undo that. That's not going to work for us. We'll just have to live with that. And this looks a little bit weird right now. So why don't we just keyframe the opacity of the matte layer, so this black and white layer. So let's just set keys on the opacity of this layer. And we'll set it up so we can see this part of the brain at this point, but As the brain starts to turn, sort of when it goes behind the ear, it'll start to fade away. I don't think anybody will notice. Let's see. Let's turn on the head again, underneath, and the head on top. It's pretty good. I think the head on top, the opacity is too high. You can see it sort of disappears there. Let's make it disappear a little bit earlier. Let's take this final key. Have it starting to disappear by... That might be too fast. Oh, that's pretty good. It's kind of hidden in that sweep there. I like that. Too fast. When you have a sudden change like that, it becomes very noticeable. So I'm just spreading those. Okay, that's a bit better. It feels like it just swept away by the ear there. And then the opacity of the head, I think, is a little too low. Let's turn this back up a little bit. Okay, so that's just an extra piece. You don't have to do that, hopefully. But you can see that by having something like kryptomat, it can help solve some problems. I also maybe want to add a new color underneath here. So I'm going to duplicate the underlying head, Control D or Command D, and I'll give it a fill effect. Okay, it's not exactly the color I'm shooting for here. So let's change this color to give kind of a dark, warm fill. And then I want to mask it out a little bit. So just select that layer, choose the rectangle tool, draw a mask around it. By default, it's an addition mask. Hit F on your keyboard to feather that mask. Right, so, and because the overlying head model is the thing that's animating, it reveals that warm head underneath. We get something like that. So, it's not perfect exactly, but it's a really good starting point. And you can see how you can experiment with this pretty quickly in a way that would be much more difficult in 3D. Okay, let's look at doing this in a slightly different way that gives you more interesting control, but it takes a little longer to set up. So I'm going to just set this whole thing up again. So take the head, drag it onto a new composition, Control or Command Y to make a solid, put it underneath, drag the brain in, rename this brain, rename this head. And we're going to do something a little different here. So we're going to duplicate the brain layer. And we're going to add a different effect to this one. So instead of kryptomat, we're going to add extractor. Now this one you can download from online. Just look up extractor for After Effecks and you'll find it's free. But what this allows us to do is to look at an EXR and extract those merged AOVs. And if I click on the layer up here, you can see it shows the cryptos, but the one that we're interested in is Z. And that's the depth map, the Z depth. And you just have to adjust the black and white points here until you can start to see the details. Now I know through trial and error for mine, if I put in a value like 16 for the black point and maybe 10 for the white points, maybe a little more, 12. Maybe change this from 16 to 18. So this is setting the black point and the white point of this image. And what this does is the lighter colored pixels are closer to the camera. The darker pixels are those parts of the model that are farther from the camera. And we can use this as a mask too, or a track mat. So let's just rename this just so it's easier to see. So this is called depth brain. And so it's sitting on top of our regularly colored brain. And we're going to use the track mat pick whip to go from regular brain to depth brain. And it will by default set it to the alpha channel, but we'll click on that. We want it to be the luma channel. And this time we don't have to invert it. And you can kind of see what's going on here. If I just hide the head, it looks like the brain is in some fog. And that's because the luma values of this are determining how much of the brain we can see. So where it's black, we don't see any of the brain. Where it's the lighter color, then we can see the brain more fully. Now, it doesn't go to pure white anywhere here. So there are parts that it never gets fully revealed. So what we can do, and it's hard to get that subtlety in these 2 points here. So what we can do instead is add a levels or curves effect to the brain, the depth brain layer. And if we just open this up a little bit, you can see the histogram showing us where the pixels are. So there's nothing all the way over here towards pure white. So if we drag this point over, it's making the lightest pixels now pure white. So now you can see more of the brain here. If I pull this over even farther, you can see it's like revealing the brain. It's emerging from the fog. And if you want to hide more of the brain, you can pull the black point to the right. And so you can just show a little bit of it here. And what this does in effect is it makes it look like the deeper parts, or the parts of the brain that are farther from the camera, are being occluded because they're deep. And you could do this sort of render in 3D, but it would be a pain. And if you needed to edit it, it would be very difficult. And because the depth changes here, if we look at our, now it's almost all white, we can keyframe that histogram to get it the way we want it to look. So let's say we keyframe the histogram at this point, and then here keyframe it again so you can see the histogram shifts. And this is the number of black to white pixels that you have. So I can just pull this over, get that kind of same kind of depth, and when I hide it, we get something like this. Right, and then when you wind up here and you want to see more of the brain, let's say we're talking about a specific sulcus or gyrus, we could do that. Or if we wanted to reveal more of the brain, we can open this up. So moving the black point backwards, so we can control this fall off. Now we've got the same issue with the brainstem here. So we could, if we wanted to, go back to our previous layer and copy that layer. So we already set that up. Bring it in here and paste this. Actually, I don't think that'll work now because we're already using a depth map on the brain. I wonder if we could use set mat for this. Let's try it. So on the original colored brain, we wanted to look at this brain 2, and we'll call this crypto brain. This is the one I set up earlier with the kryptomat, not crypto Brian. So I'm not sure that this will work, but if we, on the colored brain, if we choose set mat, add that effect, and then choose crypto brain, masks and effects. Do I have to show this there? I don't think it's going to work, actually. Yeah, we have to hide this. So crypto brain, source, no, it's Luma channel, lightness, masks and effects. It's sort of working, but it's like we have to invert it. So Let's add an invert to CryptoBrain. Let's see if this will work. It does work. Okay. So on the colored brain here, I wanted to hide the brain stem, or part of it, I should say. And because on that one, I'm already using the track mat to use the depth, I couldn't use two track mats. So CryptoBrain, instead, I'm using it as set mat. So in the colored brain, I added a set mat effect, pointed it at CryptoBrain with effect and masks turned on, and then I had to make sure it read the lightness rather than the alpha channel, because we just want to use the white and black values and not the actual alpha channel. And then it had to be inverted, so I just added an invert effect to the CryptoBrain just to reverse those blacks and whites, and it cut it out here. And so now we have a pretty nice effect that it makes it really look like the brain is inside the head here. I think I need to change my levels animation on depth brain a bit, because it kind of fades out and then comes back up too much here. So maybe at this point I would want to show a little more. There's a little funny dip here. Anyway, so I could play around with all of these keyframes, but you can see I'm not doing any re-rendering. And in the half an hour we've been chatting, I've been able to get this kind of effect with very simple rendering and just a little bit of clever compositing with some of those layers and AOVs from Arnold. I hope this is helpful. Good luck.